Florence, a city of breathtaking art, incredible wealth, and political intrigue so sharp it could cut glass. For centuries, the Medici family cast a long, opulent shadow over this vibrant center of the Renaissance. They built an empire, not with armies, but with banks and cunning. Yet their rise to power was not a peaceful ascent. Beneath the frescoes and the marble, a fierce struggle raged, fueled by ambition, betrayal, and a thirst for control. Many dared to challenge the Medici, risking everything in a desperate fight for Florence's soul. Some sought to reclaim a lost republic, others aimed to seize power for themselves. All of them ignited a firestorm. These are the stories of Florence's 10 most ruthless Medici rivals. Number 10. Francesco Valori. Florence hummed with the fervor of a spiritual awakening in the late 1490s. The Medici had been driven from the city in 1494, and a fiery Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola held immense sway over the Florentine people. Among his most devoted and powerful followers was Francesco Valori, a man whose name once carried significant weight in the Florentine government, now transformed into a zealous champion of the new, God-fearing republic. Valori came from an old, respected family, and his position lent a certain gravitas to the radical changes sweeping through the city. He believed with an unwavering conviction that Florence had strayed from its righteous path under the Medici. He saw their opulence, their humanism, and their political machinations as a corruption of true civic virtue and divine law. Valori was not merely a passive supporter of Savonarola. He became a driving force within the Republican government established after the Medici's expulsion. He truly believed Florence needed to be a pure republic, not a disguised tyranny under any family. This belief set him on an unshakable collision course with any prospect of Medici return. Valori's actions reflected his profound commitment to Savonarola's vision. He was a key figure among the Piagnoni, or Weepers, as Savonarola's most fervent followers were called, due to their penitential fervor. Valori served multiple times as Gonfaloniere of Justice, the highest executive office in the Florentine Republic. From this powerful position, he worked tirelessly to implement Savonarola's strict moral reforms. He championed laws aimed at curbing luxury, gambling, and vice, enforcing the friar's austere vision for Florence. Valori's zeal extended to political matters as well. He became a staunch opponent of the Arrabbiati, the faction that resented Savonarola's influence and sought a more traditional republican government, and especially the Palesci, the remaining Medici supporters who quietly worked for the family's restoration. Valori used his political power to consolidate the Piagnoni's control, ensuring that the government machinery was aligned with Savonarola's spiritual authority. He was instrumental in passing legislation that exiled known Medici sympathizers and prevented the Pazzi family, still infamous from their failed conspiracy, from holding office. Historians like Donald Weinstein describe Valori as a man consumed by the righteousness of his cause, a conviction that made him both powerful and uncompromising. The impact of Valori's leadership was significant. His presence in government, combined with Savonarola's preaching, helped to solidify the Republican government and keep the Medici from returning to Florence for several years. He provided the administrative backbone to the friars' spiritual revolution. Under his watch, Florence experienced a period of intense moral reform and a fierce rejection of the Medici past. This period, however, was also marked by deep political division and factional strife. Valori's uncompromising nature and the strictness of the Piagnoni laws alienated many Florentines, particularly the more moderate Republicans and those who simply missed the city's vibrant, albeit worldly, former life. His political power and zeal created as many enemies as it did allies. Records from the Florentine State Archive show numerous petitions and complaints against the severity of the Piagnoni regime, often championed by figures like Valori. The Medici, though in exile, watched these developments with keen interest. From their retreats in Rome and other cities, they used the growing discontent against Savonarola and his leading figures like Valori to their advantage. They cultivated alliances with foreign powers, particularly Pope Alexander VI, who had excommunicated Savonarola. They quietly supported the Arrabbiati faction, who sought to break Savonarola's hold, and by extension, the power of Valori and his fellow Piagnoni. The Medici understood that the more chaos and division that reigned in Florence, the more likely the citizens would eventually yearn for the stability, even if it meant their family's return. They did not directly confront Valori militarily, but rather undermined his political base from afar, exploiting the internal rifts he and Savonarola's regime created. Francesco Valori's ultimate fate was tragically intertwined with the downfall of his spiritual mentor. As Savonarola's influence waned under the weight of papal excommunication and public disillusionment, the political tide in Florence turned swiftly. The Arrabbiati gained ascendancy, and popular sentiment shifted against the once adored friar. In April 1498, after a dramatic challenge of ordeal by fire failed, Savonarola was arrested. Valori, as one of his most prominent supporters, was also seized. On May 23, 1498, just as Savonarola and his two fellow friars were about to be executed in the Piazza della Signoria, a furious mob, fueled by resentment and political opportunism, stormed Valori's home. He was dragged out into the streets. Accounts from contemporary chroniclers like Luca Landucci vividly describe the scene. Valori was brutally murdered by the mob, his body left to be desecrated. His death, a violent end to a powerful political life, symbolized the end of the extreme Savonarolan republic that had so forcefully resisted the Medici. It left Florence in a state of political flux, a vulnerability the Medici, though still in exile, would eventually exploit to return to power. Number 9. Filippo Strozzi the Younger. Filippo Strozzi the Younger was not just a rival to the Medici, he was once closely allied with them, even married into the family. He was a banking magnate, perhaps the wealthiest man in Florence after the Medici themselves, and a cultural patron in his own right, famously building the magnificent Palazzo Strozzi. Born in 1488, he initially navigated the treacherous political landscape of Florence by aligning himself with the Medici after their return in 1512. He even accompanied Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, later Pope Clement VII, to Rome. However, Strozzi was fundamentally a Republican at heart. His initial alignment with the Medici was pragmatic, a way to protect his vast family interests. As the Medici transitioned from informal rulers to overt dukes of Florence, particularly with the rule of Alessandro de' Medici, Strozzi became increasingly disillusioned. He saw Alessandro's tyranny, his disregard for Florentine liberty, and his heavy-handed rule as a betrayal of the Republic. This growing discontent festered, leading him to believe that the Medici had become an oppressive force that needed to be removed for Florence to truly flourish. His desire for a free republic, coupled with personal grievances against Alessandro, solidified his decision to become their most formidable military opponent in exile. Strozzi's actions against the Medici were bold and decisive. After the assassination of Duke Alessandro de' Medici in 1537 by his cousin Lorenzino de' Medici, Filippo Strozzi, who was in exile in France, saw a golden opportunity. He immediately rallied a significant force of Florentine exiles, many of them passionate Republicans, and hired experienced mercenaries. He personally financed this entire military expedition, pouring vast sums of his family's immense fortune into the endeavor. His goal was clear: to invade Tuscany, overthrow the newly appointed Medici Duke, Cosimo I, and restore the Florentine Republic. He leveraged his powerful connections with France, hoping for direct military support against the Emperor Charles V, who backed Cosimo I. Strozzi's plan was meticulously crafted, involving a simultaneous uprising within Florence and a military advance from outside. His forces, numbering around 4,000 men, were well-equipped and determined. Historian Alison Brown details Strozzi's commitment, noting how he pledged his entire fortune to this cause, a testament to his fervent belief in the Republican ideal. The impact of Strozzi's invasion was immense. His military challenge posed the most serious threat to the newly established ducal rule of Cosimo. the first de' Medici. Cosimo was young, only 17 years old, and still consolidating his power. Strozzi's army, composed of battle-hardened veterans and motivated exiles, represented a real and tangible danger to the fragile Medici regime. The invasion forced Cosimo to act quickly and decisively, demonstrating his nascent leadership. The political stakes were incredibly high. If Strozzi succeeded, the Medici's ducal project would collapse, and Florence would likely return to a republican government, potentially under the influence of France. If Strozzi failed, Cosimo's rule would be solidified, and the Republicans' hopes would be dashed for a generation. The Battle of Montemurlo, fought on August 1st, 1537, became the decisive moment. Cosimo I, despite his youth, demonstrated remarkable strategic acumen. He quickly mustered his forces, relying on the support of the imperial army stationed in Italy. Cosimo's general, Alessandro Vitelli, marched rapidly to confront Strozzi's army near the fortress of Montemurlo, a small town just outside Florence. The battle was swift and brutal. Strozzi's forces were caught off guard and decisively routed. Many of the Republican exiles fought fiercely, but they were overwhelmed by the superior numbers and coordination of the imperial and Medici forces. The defeat was a catastrophic blow to the Republican cause and a resounding victory for Cosimo I. Contemporary accounts, including letters from Cosimo himself, emphasize the completeness of his triumph. Filippo Strozzi, the younger, was captured during the Battle of Montemurlo. He was taken prisoner and brought back to Florence, where he was imprisoned in the formidable Fortezza di Basso, the fortress of San Giovanni Battista. His capture was a major propaganda coup for Cosimo I, who paraded his victory. Strozzi's fate was grim. He was subjected to torture, likely to extract information about other conspirators and his French connections. On December 18, 1538, Filippo Strozzi was found dead in his cell. The official verdict was suicide. However, many, both then and now, suspected foul play, believing that Cosimo I orchestrated his death to eliminate such a powerful and dangerous rival permanently. The circumstances surrounding his death remained shrouded in controversy, but the outcome was undeniable: the death of Filippo Strozzi. The younger removed the most significant threat to Cosimo I's rule and cemented the Medici's transformation from de facto rulers to absolute dukes of Florence. His legacy became a symbol of the desperate and ultimately unsuccessful struggle for Florentine liberty against Medici dominance. And number 8, Piero Soderini. Piero Soderini was not a firebrand or a military commander, but a seasoned Florentine statesman, a man of cautious diplomacy and republican principle. Born into an old and respected Florentine family in 1450, Soderini rose through the ranks of government before the Medici's final return. He was elected Gonfalonier for life in 1502, a radical innovation in Florentine politics. This position, traditionally held for a short term, was now transformed into a lifetime appointment, an attempt to bring stability and consistency to the often turbulent Republican government. Soderini's beef with the Medici was not born of personal hatred or family feud, but from a deep-seated belief in the Florentine Republic. He viewed the Medici as a corrupting influence, a family that had, for generations, undermined the city's democratic institutions and replaced them with their own informal but absolute rule. He aimed to create a stable, enduring republic, one strong enough to resist the persistent threat of Medici restoration. He believed that the Medici, even in exile, represented a constant danger to the liberty of Florence. Soderini's actions as Gonfalonier were focused on strengthening the Republican institutions and securing Florence's independence. He understood that a key weakness of the Republic was its reliance on unreliable mercenary armies. To remedy this, he famously established a standing Florentine militia, a citizen army, with the crucial advice of his secretary, Niccolo Machiavelli. This was a revolutionary concept for the time, aimed at giving Florence a genuine military backbone, answerable to the Republic, not to foreign paymasters. Soderini also pursued a cautious foreign policy, attempting to balance Florence between the dominant European powers of France and Spain, knowing that either could influence or even invade Florence. He consistently refused to allow the Medici to return from exile, despite growing pressure from the papacy and other Italian states. He saw their return as an existential threat to the republican ideals he championed. Contemporary Florentine histories, such as those by Francesco Guicciardini, often portray Soderini as a well-intentioned but perhaps overly cautious leader dedicated to the Republic's survival. The impact of Soderini's decade in power was significant. His tenure from 1502 to 1512 represented the longest period of continuous Republican rule without Medici interference in Florence during this tumultuous era. Under his leadership, Florence regained some measure of stability and independence. The militia, though imperfect, demonstrated its potential by successfully recapturing Pisa in 1509 after a long siege, a significant achievement for Florence. Soderini's government, despite its challenges, allowed a generation of Florentines to experience life without the direct, pervasive influence of the Medici. He tried to steer Florence through complex alliances and wars, working to preserve its freedom and its republican character. However, his cautious approach also led to criticism, with some powerful Florentine families feeling he was too indecisive or too lenient with Medici sympathizers. The Medici, from their various places of exile, never stopped plotting their return. They viewed Soderini's government as a temporary aberration, an illegitimate regime that needed to be overthrown. They cultivated powerful alliances, particularly with Pope Julius II, a fiercely ambitious pontiff who sought to restore papal authority throughout Italy and resented Florence's independent stance. The Medici, led by Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, later Pope Leo X, joined Pope Julius II's Holy League, an alliance formed to drive the French out of Italy. Their strategy was clear leverage, papal and Spanish military power to force their way back into Florence. They continually pressured Soderini and his government through diplomatic channels, and by supporting internal opposition within Florence. Piero Soderini's ultimate fate was decided by the shifting tides of European power. In 1512, the Holy League, with Medici backing and led by Spanish troops, marched on Florence. The Spanish army, under the command of Ramon de Cardona, brutally sacked the nearby town of Prato, a clear warning to Florence. The horror of Prato, detailed in chronicles of the time, convinced the Florentine government that resistance was futile. Rather than risk the sack of Florence itself, the city surrendered. Soderini was forced to flee. He escaped Florence and eventually settled in Rome, where he lived in exile for the rest of his life, often under the protection of Pope Leo X, the very Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici. He had fought so hard to keep out of Florence. His expulsion marked the end of Florence's last truly independent republican government before the final ducal establishment. It paved the way for the triumphant return of the Medici, who re-established their control over the city, ushering in another long period of their dominance. Soderini died in 1522, a republican out of time, witnessing from afar the Medici's continued grip on his beloved city. Number 7. Girolamo Savonarola. Girolamo Savonarola was an unlikely rival to the Medici. He was not a banker, a statesman, or a military leader, but a Dominican friar, frail in appearance yet possessed of an oratorical power that captivated and terrified Florence. Arriving in Florence in 1489, Savonarola began preaching with an intensity that quickly drew massive crowds. His sermons were apocalyptic, filled with denunciations of the city's corruption, its excessive wealth, and its indulgence in what he saw as pagan art and philosophy. He saw Florence as a modern Babylon, in dire need of spiritual cleansing, and he famously denounced Lorenzo the Magnificent as a tyrant whose family's opulence and secular humanism were leading the city to damnation. His beef with the Medici was not political in the traditional sense, but deeply moral and spiritual. He believed their rule was an affront to God, and that only a true, divinely guided republic could save Florence from impending doom. Savonarola's actions were revolutionary. His fiery prophecies of an approaching flood of divine wrath seemed to be fulfilled when King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy in 1494. When Piero de' Medici, Lorenzo's inept son, made a disastrous and humiliating surrender to the French king, the long-simmering discontent against the Medici erupted. The family was swiftly expelled from Florence. Into this power vacuum stepped Savonarola. He became the de facto spiritual and political leader of the new Florentine Republic. He guided the city's new government, advocating for a theocracy where Christ was the true king of Florence. He orchestrated infamous bonfires of the vanities, where luxury items, secular books, artwork, and gambling tools were publicly burned in the Piazza della Signoria as Florence sought to purify its soul. He imposed strict moral codes, turning Florence into a city of austere piety, and his influence over the government was immense. The city, according to contemporary accounts, including those compiled by Roberto Rodolfi, was utterly transformed by his fervent preaching and the fear of divine judgment. The impact of Savonarola's rise was immediate and profound. He directly led to the expulsion of the Medici in 1494, something no political or military rival had managed to sustain for long. For several years, Florence became a unique republic, a theocratic experiment governed by the friar's severe principles. His influence created a deeply divided city. On one side were his Piagnoni followers, zealous and unyielding. On the other were the Erbiati, who resented his moralistic tyranny, and the Palasci. There were many Medici loyalists who secretly worked for the family's return. The bonfires of the vanities, while symbolic of his power, also sparked controversy and opposition from artists and humanists who felt their work was being destroyed. And Savonarola's radical vision reshaped Florence's political and social landscape, but his unwavering commitment to his ideals also made him inflexible and uncompromising. The Medici, from their exile, did not directly confront Savonarola with an army. Instead, they cleverly exploited the growing opposition to the friar, both within Florence and from outside. They used their connections in Rome to pressure Pope Alexander VI, who viewed Savonarola's defiance of papal authority as a direct challenge to his own power. The Pope excommunicated Savonarola in 1497, a devastating blow to a man whose authority stemmed from his spiritual purity. The Medici quietly supported the Arrabbiati faction, fanning the flames of discontent against the friar's increasingly rigid rule and his refusal to back down from the Pope. They understood that time and internal strife were their allies, weakening the Republican government and paving the way for their eventual return. Girolamo Savonarola's ultimate fate was as dramatic and tragic as his rise. His radicalism and defiance of papal authority eventually led to his downfall. The Florentine people, weary of the friar's prophecies that never fully materialized and exhausted by the constant internal strife and papal interdicts that damaged their trade, began to turn against him. A series of events, including the failed ordeal by fire in April 1498, a challenge meant to prove his divine favor, shattered his credibility. On May 23, 1498, after being arrested and brutally tortured, Girolamo Savonarola, along with two of his loyal friars, Domenico da Pescia and Silvestro Maruffi, was hanged from a gallows in the Piazza della Signoria. Their bodies were then burned and their ashes thrown into the Arno River to prevent any relics from being collected. His execution, watched by a vast crowd, symbolized the end of the theocratic republic and cleared the path for Florence to seek a more stable, though not necessarily free, future, eventually leading to the Medici's triumphant return. Number 6. Ferdinand I of Naples. Ferdinand I, known as Ferrante, King of Naples from 1458 to 1494, was a formidable and ruthless Italian ruler. His kingdom, located in the southern part of the Italian peninsula, commanded a powerful army and held significant strategic importance. Ferdinand was a master of political maneuvering, constantly seeking to expand his influence and protect his borders from rival Italian states and encroaching foreign powers. His beef with the Medici, particularly Lorenzo the Magnificent, stemmed from his ambition and his perception of the Medici controlled Florence as a barrier to his wider regional power. Florence, aligned in a fragile peace with Milan and Venice, represented a counterweight to Neapolitan power in the peninsula. Ferdinand resented the Medici's growing diplomatic influence, particularly Lorenzo's skill in maintaining the fragile balance of power that kept Italy from being dominated by any single entity, including Naples. Furthermore, Ferdinand had a crucial alliance with Pope Sixtus IV, who also harbored deep animosity towards Lorenzo de' Medici. And Ferdinand's actions against the Medici were both direct and military. He became a crucial player in the infamous Pazzi conspiracy of 1478. While not directly involved in the assassination plot, he was a key patron and military backer of the conspirators. He promised military support to the Pazzi and Pope Sixtus IV, ready to invade Florentine territory as soon as the Medici brothers were eliminated. After the conspiracy failed and Lorenzo de' Medici survived, Ferdinand fulfilled his promise. His troops, under the command of his son Alfonso, Duke of Calabria, invaded Tuscany. This military intervention escalated the Pazzi conspiracy from a failed coup into a full-scale war, known as the Pazzi War 1478 to 1480. Ferdinand aimed to crush Florence militarily, weaken Lorenzo de' Medici, and potentially carve out territory for himself or his allies. The war was brutal, characterized by sieges, skirmishes, and widespread devastation across the Florentine countryside. Accounts from the time, such as those by Angelo Poliziano, detail the hardships faced by the Florentine people during this conflict. The impact of Ferdinand's military involvement was immense. The Pazzi War plunged Florence into 2 years of intense conflict, causing immense suffering, economic devastation, and political instability. Florence, despite its wealth, was not a military power on par with Naples. The war strained the city's resources to their breaking point, necessitating heavy taxes and loans. The alliance between Naples and the papacy placed Florence in a desperate situation, isolated and besieged. Ferdinand's military might threaten to dismantle the Florentine state and destroy the Medici's hold on the city, potentially leading to its subjugation. The war underscored the fragility of Florentine power and Lorenzo's precarious position. The Medici response, particularly Lorenzo de' Medici's, was one of the most daring and celebrated diplomatic maneuvers in Renaissance history. Faced with a seemingly unwinnable war against two major powers, Lorenzo took a desperate gamble. In December 1479, without consulting the Florentine government and against the advice of many, he embarked on a perilous journey to Naples. He traveled alone, putting his life entirely in the hands of King Ferdinand, a man who had actively sought his destruction. This act of immense personal courage and diplomatic audacity was unprecedented. Lorenzo spent several weeks in Naples, engaging in direct, face-to-face negotiations with Ferdinand. He appealed to Ferdinand's sense of honor, his pragmatic understanding of Italian politics, and, crucially, highlighted the growing threat of the Ottoman Empire, which was then encroaching on Italy's eastern coast. Lorenzo argued that a divided Italy, embroiled in internal wars, was vulnerable to foreign invasion. But Ferdinand I, a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, was reportedly impressed by Lorenzo's courage and diplomatic skill. He also recognized the growing threat of the Ottomans. Ultimately, Ferdinand decided it was in his best interest to make a separate peace with Florence, breaking his alliance with Pope Sixtus IV. The Treaty of Naples, signed in March 1480, ended the Pazzi War. This diplomatic triumph was a masterstroke by Lorenzo. It isolated Sixtus IV, who was forced to make peace with Florence soon after. The war, which had threatened to destroy the Medici and Florence, instead solidified Lorenzo's reputation as a brilliant statesman and a peacemaker, earning him the moniker Il Magnifico. And Ferdinand I, having achieved a more stable Italy and avoided further conflict with Florence, died in 1494, leaving behind a complex legacy of ruthless ambition and cunning diplomacy. Number 5. Pope Sixtus IV. Francesco della Rovere, who ascended to the papacy as Pope Sixtus IV in 1471, was no spiritual recluse. He was a powerful, ambitious, and deeply secular pontiff notorious for his ruthless political maneuvering and his blatant nepotism. His primary goal was to expand the temporal power of the Papal States and to enrich his own family, particularly his numerous nephews, by carving out principalities for them in Italy. His beef with the Medici, especially Lorenzo the Magnificent, was fierce and deeply personal. Sixtus viewed Lorenzo's immense diplomatic influence and his control over the Papal States' finances through the Medici Bank as a direct impediment to his ambitions. Lorenzo had also opposed Sixtus's appointments, including blocking the Pope's preferred candidate for the Archbishopric of Florence, a slight that Sixtus never forgot. The Pope saw Lorenzo as a rival who stood in the way of his family's ascendancy and papal dominance over the Italian peninsula. Sixtus IV's actions against the Medici were shockingly direct and brutal. He was not merely a passive supporter of the Pazzi conspiracy, he actively encouraged, sanctioned, and financially backed the plot to assassinate Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici. He secretly agreed that the conspirators could use violence to overthrow the Medici regime, though he later claimed he only meant for them to be removed from power, not killed. He appointed Francesco Salviati, a known Medici enemy, as Archbishop of Pisa, knowing it would infuriate Lorenzo and provide a high-ranking ecclesiastical figure within the conspiracy. After the Pazzi conspiracy failed to kill Lorenzo, and Florence brutally executed the conspirators, Sixtus IV, enraged, took extreme measures. He excommunicated Lorenzo de' Medici and the entire Florentine government. He then placed Florence under interdict, a severe ecclesiastical punishment that forbade all religious services in the city. Finally, he allied with King Ferdinand I of Naples and declared open war on Florence, launching the devastating Pazzi War 1478 to 1480 with the explicit aim of overthrowing the Medici and establishing a more compliant government in Florence, perhaps even bringing the city under direct papal control. Accounts from contemporary chroniclers like Niccolo Machiavelli detail the Pope's intense animosity and his clear involvement in the conspiracy. The impact of Sixtus IV's actions was catastrophic for Florence. His papal sanction gave the Pazzi conspiracy a veneer of legitimacy, leading to the murder of Giuliano de' Medici and plunging the city into a brutal 2-year war. The excommunication and interdict caused immense distress among the pious Florentine population, creating a spiritual crisis alongside the political one. The war itself drained Florence's treasury, devastated its countryside, and threatened its very existence as an independent state. Sixtus IV's ruthless determination to destroy the Medici transformed a local Florentine power struggle into a major Italian war, demonstrating the immense temporal power of the papacy in the Renaissance. His actions highlighted the precarious position of any Italian state that dared to defy a powerful pontiff. The Medici response, led by Lorenzo the Magnificent, was a combination of military defense, diplomatic maneuvering, and public relations. Lorenzo rallied the Florentine people, who largely supported the Medici against the Pazzi and the Pope. He used propaganda, famously commissioning effigies of the hanged conspirators to reinforce the Medici's legitimacy. Militarily, Florence defended itself as best it could against the combined forces of Naples and the papacy. However, the most decisive move was Lorenzo's audacious diplomatic gamble, his personal trip to Naples in late 1479. By negotiating directly with King Ferdinand I, Lorenzo successfully broke the alliance between Naples and the papacy, isolating Sixtus IV and severely weakening his war effort. This strategic brilliance forced Sixtus IV to reconsider his position. Pope Sixtus IV, despite his initial fury and determination, was eventually compelled to make peace with Florence. Lorenzo's success in Naples, coupled with the growing threat of an Ottoman invasion of southern Italy, which required Ferdinand's immediate attention, made the war unsustainable for Sixtus. In 1480, a peace treaty was signed. Sixtus IV lifted the interdict and excommunication, though his animosity towards Lorenzo persisted. He never achieved his goal of dominating Florence or destroying the Medici, but his actions had a profound and bloody impact on the city, marking one of the darkest periods in its Renaissance history. Sixtus IV died in 1484, leaving behind a papacy transformed by his aggressive temporal ambitions and a legacy forever intertwined with the violence of the Pazzi conspiracy. Number 4, Girolamo Riario. Girolamo Riario was arguably the most dangerous and ruthless of Pope Sixtus IV's numerous nephews, showered with titles and territories by his ambitious uncle. He was made Lord of Imola and Forli, and his insatiable hunger for power and wealth knew few bounds. Riario's beef with the Medici was rooted in pure ambition and a profound resentment of Lorenzo the Magnificent's influence. He saw Lorenzo as the chief obstacle to his own expansionist designs in the Romagna region, a strategic area that bordered the Papal States and Florence. Crucially, Riario also deeply resented the Medici's control over papal finances. For a time, the Pazzi Bank had managed the papal accounts, but Lorenzo had maneuvered to have them returned to the Medici Bank. This financial control, combined with Lorenzo's diplomatic sway, directly thwarted Riario's plans to fund his territorial conquests. He saw Lorenzo as an impediment to his destiny. Riario's actions were central to the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478. He was not just a supporter. Many historians, drawing on contemporary confessions, consider him the primary instigator and mastermind alongside Francesco Salviati, where Riario was the one who initially approached the Pazzi family, leveraging their long-standing rivalry and grievances against the Medici. He secured Pope Sixtus IV's crucial backing for the plot, persuading his uncle that the removal of Lorenzo was essential for papal authority. Riario meticulously helped plan the details of the assassination attempt, ensuring the precise moment and location. He helped secure the services of assassins, including the condottiero Giovanni Battista da Montesecco, and coordinated with papal and Neapolitan forces to launch a simultaneous invasion once the Medici brothers were dead. His motivation was clear: eliminate Lorenzo, seize control of Florence, and gain immense wealth and political power for himself and his family. The testimony of Montesecco, documented in historical sources, points to Riario as the driving force behind the plot's execution. The impact of Riario's relentless scheming was devastating. His machinations directly led to the Pazzi conspiracy, one of the most infamous and bloody events in Florentine history. The conspiracy resulted in the brutal murder of Giuliano de' Medici inside Florence Cathedral, and a widespread violent backlash throughout the city. The plot plunged Florence into a 2-year war with the papacy in Naples, causing immense suffering and financial ruin, and Riario's ambition unleashed a wave of violence that reshaped the political landscape of Italy. He was a driving force behind the bloodshed, an embodiment of the era's ruthless pursuit of power. His involvement ensured that the conspiracy was not just a local Florentine feud, but a high-stakes Italian power play with papal backing. The Medici response, particularly Lorenzo's, viewed Riario as a primary instigator of the conspiracy and the subsequent war. Lorenzo's immediate reaction, after surviving the attack, was to rally the Florentine populace against the conspirators, including Riario. He understood that isolating Riario and Sixtus IV was paramount to ending the war. Lorenzo's daring diplomatic trip to Naples was specifically aimed at breaking the alliance that Riario and Sixtus had forged with King Ferdinand. By separating Ferdinand from the papal Riario faction, Lorenzo strategically undermined their military and political position, forcing them to negotiate. Lorenzo publicly denounced Riario as a primary instigator of the conspiracy, and Riario became a figure of intense hatred in Florence. Girolamo Riario's ultimate fate, perhaps fittingly, mirrored the violence he had so readily instigated. Despite the spectacular failure of the Pazzi conspiracy, Riario continued to pursue his ambitions in the Romagna. He established a tyrannical rule over his territories of Imola and Forli. He married Caterina Sforza, a famously fierce and cunning warrior woman. However, his heavy-handed rule and his relentless pursuit of power made him many enemies. On April 14, 1488, Girolamo Riario was assassinated by members of the Orsi family, local nobles in Forli who had personal grievances against his oppressive regime. His body was thrown from a window. His violent end, at the hands of those he had wronged, brought a sudden conclusion to the career of a man who had brought so much bloodshed to Florence and to Italy. His death solidified the Medici's continued survival as one of their most dangerous foes was removed from the political stage. Number 3. Francesco Salviati. Francesco Salviati was a man of high clerical rank, but with a burning personal grievance against Lorenzo de' Medici. Born into a prominent Florentine banking family, one that had historic ties to the Medici, but also harbored deep-seated rivalries, Salviati pursued an ecclesiastical career. He was appointed Archbishop of Pisa by Pope Sixtus IV in 1475. This appointment itself was a direct challenge to Lorenzo, who had blocked Salviati from becoming Archbishop of Florence, and had even tried to prevent him from taking up his post in Pisa, withholding his revenues. Lorenzo viewed Salviati as too ambitious and too closely allied with powerful figures hostile to the Medici. This personal slight, coupled with a broader resentment of the Medici's overbearing control over Florence, fueled Salviati's profound hatred for Lorenzo. He saw the Medici as undermining not just his personal authority, but the rightful influence of established Florentine families and the church itself. Salviati's actions were central to the Pazzi conspiracy of April 26, 1478. He became a key co-conspirator, actively planning and participating in the plot to assassinate Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici. His role was crucial. While the assassinations were taking place in Florence Cathedral, Salviati was tasked with leading a separate group of conspirators to seize the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of Florentine government. The plan was to storm the building, kill the Gonfaloniere of Justice and other key officials, and install a new government sympathetic to the Pazzi and the Pope. Salviati believed that, with the Medici brothers dead and the government seized, the people of Florence would rally to the conspirators and overthrow the Medici regime. He was present in the cathedral during the assassination attempt, awaiting the signal to launch his part of the coup. Historians like Lauro Martini's highlight Salviati's fanaticism and deep personal commitment to the conspiracy. The impact of Salviati's involvement was immense. His presence as an archbishop lent a veneer of legitimacy to the otherwise shocking plot, linking it directly to the highest levels of the church through Pope Sixtus IV. His plan to seize the Palazzo della Signoria was a critical component of the coup, intended to decapitate the Florentine government and prevent any organized resistance. Had Salviati succeeded in taking the Palazzo, the outcome of the conspiracy might have been entirely different, plunging Florence into even greater chaos and potentially leading to the complete overthrow of the Medici. His involvement transformed a family feud into a plot with ecclesiastical and international ramifications. The Medici response was swift and brutal after the failed assassination attempt. Lorenzo de' Medici, though wounded, managed to escape the cathedral and rallied the Florentine populace. The city erupted in a passionate defense of the Medici. Francesco Salviati, having failed to seize the Palazzo della Signoria due to the Gonfaloniere Cesare Petrucci locking the doors and raising the alarm, found himself trapped. The Florentine people, enraged by the assassination of Giuliano and the assault on Lorenzo, immediately hunted down the conspirators. Salviati's role in the coup was undeniable, and his capture was inevitable. Francesco Salviati's ultimate fate was swift and ignominious. On April 26, 1478, the very day of the failed conspiracy, Archbishop Salviati was captured inside the Palazzo della Signoria. Without trial, he was immediately hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. He was still wearing his full episcopal robes as he was executed, a chilling spectacle witnessed by a furious crowd. His body, along with those of other conspirators, was left dangling as a brutal warning. The summary execution of an archbishop, a man of God, sent shockwaves across Italy, highlighting the ferocity of the Medici's revenge and the depth of their power in Florence. Salviati's death was a stark and bloody testament to the dangers of conspiring against the Medici, and his hanging became an enduring image of the Pazzi conspiracy's brutal aftermath. Number 2, the Pazzi family. The Pazzi family was one of the most ancient and immensely wealthy banking families in Florence, second only to the Medici in prestige and economic power. For generations, they had been rivals to the Medici, a simmering competition for influence, status, and control over Florentine life. This rivalry intensified under Lorenzo de' Medici, who systematically worked to curb the Pazzi's power, diverting papal banking revenues from their bank to the Medicis, and even interfering with their inheritance claims, specifically the legacy of Giovanni de' Pazzi. The Pazzi felt increasingly overshadowed, oppressed, and financially targeted by the Medici's overwhelming dominance. They viewed the Medici as illegitimate tyrants who stifled their family's rightful prominence and undermined the very republican spirit of Florence. This deep-seated resentment festered, leading them to conceive of a desperate and bloody solution. The Pazzi family's actions culminated in the infamous Pazzi conspiracy of April 26, 1478. Led by key members Jacopo de' Pazzi, his nephew Francesco de' Pazzi, and another nephew Renato de' Pazzi, they plotted with an array of powerful figures: Pope Sixtus IV, his ruthless nephew Girolamo Riario, Archbishop Francesco Salviati, and even King Ferdinand of Naples. Their plan was audacious and ruthless: to assassinate both Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici simultaneously during Mass at Florence Cathedral on Easter Sunday. The murder was to be the signal for a wider coup, led by Salviati, to seize the government palace and overthrow the Medici regime. Francesco de' Pazzi himself, along with the condottiero Bernardo Baroncelli, attacked Giuliano with daggers, inflicting multiple fatal wounds. Lorenzo, though attacked by a priest named Stefano da Bagnoni and a condottiero named Antonio Maffei, managed to escape with only a neck wound, largely due to the quick thinking of his companions who shielded him. Accounts from the Florentine chronicler Agnolo Poliziano provide gruesome details of the attack. The impact of the Pazzi conspiracy was catastrophic. It resulted in the brutal and public murder of Giuliano de' Medici inside a church, a profound shock to Florence and all of Italy. The failure to kill Lorenzo, however, proved to be the conspirators' undoing. The assassination attempt sparked a citywide manhunt for the conspirators and their supporters. The Florentine populace surprisingly rallied fiercely to the Medici, erupting in a violent frenzy against the Pazzi. The conspiracy led to a brutal crackdown, summary executions, and eventually a devastating 2-year war with the papacy and Naples, leaving Florence devastated and indebted. The conspiracy dramatically solidified the Medici's grip on power by eliminating their direct rivals and proving to the populace that the Medici were the true protectors of the city against external threats. The Medici response was immediate and merciless. Lorenzo de' Medici, despite his grief and wounds, showed remarkable calm and leadership. He organized the city's defense and unleashed a wave of retribution against the conspirators. The Florentine people yelling, "Pal, Pal," the Medici family emblem of balls, hunted down anyone associated with the Pazzi. Jacopo de' Pazzi was initially captured, trying to flee and brought back to Florence. Francesco de' Pazzi, severely wounded during the attack on Giuliano, was found and dragged through the streets. Renato de' Pazzi, who had initially escaped, was also captured. The ultimate fate of the Pazzi family was utter destruction. Jacopo de' Pazzi, Francesco de' Pazzi, Renato de' Pazzi, and many other conspirators and their supporters were captured, often tortured, and brutally executed by hanging from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. Their bodies were often paraded through the streets, mutilated, or even thrown into the Arno River in a display of public fury and Medici vengeance. Jacopo's body was later dug up from consecrated ground by the mob and tossed into the Arno. The Pazzi family's properties were confiscated, their coat of arms was defaced throughout the city, and their very name was officially erased from public records. The family's surviving members were exiled. The Pazzi family, once a pillar of Florentine society, was effectively destroyed as a political and economic force. Their failed conspiracy solidified the Medici's power for generations, demonstrating the ruthless efficiency with which the Medici eliminated their enemies. Number 1. Rinaldo degli Albizzi. Rinaldo degli Albizzi was not a single event, but a generational struggle against the very ascent of the Medici. He was a leading figure of the old Florentine oligarchy, born into one of the city's most ancient and powerful noble families. For centuries, the Albizzi had been at the pinnacle of Florentine politics, upholding the traditional republican system where power was shared among a few prominent families. Rinaldo's beef with the Medici, specifically Cosimo the Elder, was fundamental. He saw the Medici as dangerous upstarts who were systematically undermining Florence's traditional republican government. He believed Cosimo was accumulating too much personal wealth and influence, using his banking empire to control the city's political institutions from behind the scenes. Rinaldo viewed Cosimo as a tyrant without a title, effectively transforming the republic into a hidden signoria, a one-man rule. He feared that the Medici threatened the true liberty and traditional governance of Florence, an ideal he was determined to preserve. Rinaldo's actions against the Medici were direct and audacious. In 1433, sensing Cosimo's growing power and popularity, Rinaldo used his considerable influence within the Florentine government to engineer a political coup. He convinced the Gonfalonier of Justice, Bernardo Guadagni, to arrest Cosimo de' Medici on charges of treason. Cosimo was imprisoned in the Palazzo della Signoria, where he awaited trial and a potential death sentence. Rinaldo's intention was clear: to eliminate Cosimo, either through execution or permanent exile, and thereby break the Medici's burgeoning power once and for all. After Cosimo's arrest, Rinaldo attempted to purge Medici supporters from the government, consolidating his own faction's control and re-establishing the traditional oligarchic rule. Historian Ferdinand Cheville describes Rinaldo's intense commitment to this final desperate move against the Medici. The immediate impact of Rinaldo's actions was a brief success. Cosimo de' Medici, for a time, was indeed removed from Florence. The city experienced a period of political upheaval as the Albizzi faction took control and tried to dismantle the Medici's vast network of influence. This was a direct, head-on confrontation between the old guard and the rising power. However, Rinaldo's victory proved to be short-lived. Despite Cosimo's imprisonment, the Medici's extensive financial and political network remained largely intact. Cosimo himself, through strategic bribes and the loyalty of his supporters, managed to avoid execution, instead securing a sentence of exile to Padua. This leniency, a testament to Cosimo's enduring influence even from a prison cell, would prove fatal to Rinaldo's long-term plans. The Medici response, orchestrated by Cosimo from exile, was a masterclass in patient and strategic countermaneuvering. Cosimo did not rush back to Florence. Instead, he calmly used his immense wealth and international connections to manipulate the situation from afar. He recalled all Medici loans from Florentine merchants and families, triggering a severe financial crisis in the city. He ensured that Medici trade agreements with other European powers were disrupted. The Florentine economy, heavily reliant on Medici banking and trade, began to suffer dramatically under the Albizzi government. The populace, witnessing the economic downturn and the instability of Albizzi rule, began to miss the prosperity associated with the Medici. Cosimo's network of supporters within Florence worked tirelessly to sow discontent and advocate for his return, painting him as the only one who could restore Florence's economic health. But Rinaldo degli Albizzi's ultimate fate was one of permanent exile and defeat. Within a year of Cosimo's banishment, the political winds in Florence shifted decisively. The financial crisis deepened, and the pro-Medici sentiment grew. In 1434, a new Gonfalonier and a Signoria sympathetic to Cosimo were elected. Cosimo de' Medici was triumphantly recalled to Florence, returning to a hero's welcome. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, in turn, was exiled from Florence for life. He spent the remainder of his days unsuccessfully trying to organize military interventions from abroad, urging other Italian states to invade Florence and overthrow the Medici. He never saw Florence again, dying in Ancona in 1450. His failure marked the definitive end of the old Florentine oligarchy's direct political dominance and ushered in the era of overt Medici control, a period that would shape the city for centuries to come.